The weather forecast, even after rescheduling the trip once, was still depressingly grim, but I felt like I had to give a bad idea a chance to succeed. That's kind of the motto of this video, honestly. So I took the dogs to boarding, of course on the day the yard was flooded for irrigation, headed to the airport, headed back across the airport because I went to a closed parking lot, got on the flight, took off across the endless Phoenix suburbs with South Mountain, the largest city-owned park in the world, in view. And after 5 more hours, we passed over the spectacular Chugach State Park and Kenai Peninsula for a landing in Anchorage. A few hours of sleep in the rental car, a few groceries in the morning, and I was on the road with a spectacularly clear Denali towering over the highway, and eventually passing by the southern end of the straight line before heading into the park. I got my backcountry permit, and after some final, even more depressing weather checks, rode the bus out to the start point to set off down the line where a magnificent caribou was hanging out by the road within sight of my starting point. Picking up right where I left off as a lone road into the park in June, I set off for the remaining 24 miles with a clear awareness that success wasn't guaranteed, but I had full intentions of going for it if I had a good feeling about my progress, energy, and other things after the first day. No matter what else happened, it was a good feeling to head off the road and away from everything. Okay, August 14, and I'll explain what's going on once I get across the creek, but I just came from that caribou traffic jam down there and heading down the line. This little stretch just goes through or next to a campground and parking lot complex, a couple little trails and stuff. And then at a quarter mile, crosses Jenny Creek. It's the last bathroom we'll see for a few days. Won't get to stay on this long, but it goes for a few feet. No, sorry. We're drifting pretty far off. A few minutes later, the forest began to open up and allowed the first view of today's destination, the top of that high, flat, and inconveniently nameless mountain to the south, and a last few steps on human infrastructure before the planned 4 days of wilderness hiking. Hello, ptarmigan. Thanks. Like the ones from episode 1. No time for the camera now, though. There's human and moose tracks here. This is one of the best spots in the park to see moose, especially in winter. On this fairly mellow segment of the line, Jenny Creek was the first inconvenience, if not exactly a real obstacle. I almost had episode 1 end down here at the creek, but I was so over it by then that I just quit at the road. This is Jenny Creek, and looks like I'm in some luck. I've had to wade across this with it being knee deep before, and I probably should take my shoes off, but let's see how dry I can stay here. Been going over the tops of my shoes, but that wasn't working. This round one just like rolled. I wasn't about to start the mission with soaked feet and had just expected to take off my shoes and pants, go across barefoot, and be on my way. But it was just shallow enough that I ended up actually wasting more time trying to find a solution than if I had just undressed in the first place. Good enough. Okay, since I didn't have to take my pants off, get dressed again, I'll fix some things now. Okay, the creek crossing is, I'd say, basically where the wilderness adventure starts. There are trails down to the creek, but anyone crossing the creek probably has a reason to come out here and not just the people doing day use activities. So this isn't so much a litany of complaints as a little bit of explanation of the less than ideal situation at the start of the trip. I was supposed to come a week ago. The weather forecast was really terrible, which turned out to be true, so I'm glad I skipped it. But the only nice thing I can say about this week is today's good, and maybe it's not as, the rest of it's not as bad as last week was. You could probably see a little bit ago. We won't see again for a bit. There's already snow on the higher mountains from last week's storm, so I hope that doesn't complicate things. It shouldn't too much. I was hoping to do this before any new snow on the high elevations. At a minimum, it can just make the rocks slick. You know, it's not like a deep snowpack you get traction in. But then the weather forecast after today, which is nice and a little bit breezy. It was supposed to be clear, and now it's not very clear. We probably won't see Denali, maybe at all. But tomorrow is a lot of elevation gain, ending at the crest of the range, in theory. And that is right when winds from a big regional pressure gradient are supposed to peak and rain's supposed to move in. So by the end of the day tomorrow, it's supposed to be raining and potentially 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts on the peaks, which is also where the snow is. So tomorrow night, wherever I end up, it's probably going to be a rough night. It might cause me to make some routing choices, some camping choices that are different than I expected. If I've got the energy, I can get over the crest earlier in the day and camp at a lower elevation. I wanted to stay higher up for a view, but it's not really the most scenic weather. So my goal is to start early, get over the worst of it before the rain starts. Can't avoid the wind no matter what. Just see how it goes from there. But I couldn't put this off another week. Next week's weather's looking bad. It didn't really fit into my life as well. A couple other complications, so it's this week or nothing. The good news is it didn't seem hopeless, and I'm out here starting it. My standard is finishing. That's a success. As far as failing goes, I mean, I can fail to survive it. I could get injured and get helicoptered out, fail to complete it. I could give up sometime tomorrow and backtrack out, not even make it across the range. I could make it over the range, but run into problems and have to abandon the line altogether, take a low elevation route out. But if I can make any semblance of sticking to this line, getting to the other end of it, I think that's a good enough success that I can mentally let it go and move on with my life. Otherwise it probably would gnaw at me. I'd probably be back out here again next year for it. It's a tough thing about it. It's so restrictive. You know, the June trip when I was here, the thunderstorms each afternoon, like, you don't want to be up on a ridgeline for those like I ended up being. I wouldn't want to plan a mission to be in thunderstorm season here. Could maybe do it a little bit later in July. There's just not a lot of flexibility or cushion.
My intentions were driven as much as anything by the thought of having this mission hanging over my head for another 10 or 11 months. But already the reality of what I was up against was starting to win out in my mind. I had plenty of time as I walked to dwell on the weather ahead.
Ptarmigan eggs, I guess. Most likely overlearned the water lesson from last time. I'm probably carrying way too much. I wouldn't be surprised if I feel like I have to just dump some out to get up this hill. But I still don't know about small creeks on the far side of it tomorrow. So in theory I've got enough water for half the day tomorrow before I even worry about it.
I said I was prepared to continue if I felt things were going my way, but instead I was making a little bit slower progress against more resistance than I had been hoping for. I knew I had miles of dwarf birch to cross at the start, but it can be anything from firm, easy going at a solid walking pace like early in episode 1, to marshy, mushy, mossy stuff that just sucks the energy out of every step. And that's more like what I was getting today. On top of that, my uncertainty about the next water source and the experiences of June and poor water management meant that I carried enough water this time for almost 2 days, plus enough insulation and gear I hoped to survive the forecast weather. So the pack that felt heavy but tolerable at the start was starting to feel like something that I'd struggle with across the 16,000 feet of elevation gain ahead on this line, even with it lightening some as some things were consumed. And I really began to weigh my views of the experience that I'd have if I completed the trip this year, but potentially hiking in clouds for multiple days, seeing none of the scenery that the line had to offer, against just waiting for next summer and a chance to modify the approach and get better weather. As it happens, when I returned to Denali in September of this summer, the forecast was of course unsuitable again. I didn't make another attempt. But I did take the chance to solve my water mystery on an epic all-day hike. I'll have a straight line mission supplement video up on the channel soon, taking you along if you want to see what I found and also to see what it's like to hike up into the clouds in poor weather and some of what I could have encountered on this attempt.
Dwarf birch just starting to turn color. This entire valley will be solid orange in a couple weeks.
As I was expecting, this was the one segment of the line likely to be pretty drama-free. When I go again next year and have to re-walk this, I'll probably speed through this segment with just highlights, if there even are any, and pick up the real story of the mission at the top of the mountain.
So the only real obstacle on today's segment is that big wedge-shaped lower slope. Kind of go up that, and then right above it there's some rock outcrops, cliffs. Line goes kind of right up those, but there should be a way to scramble up or next to them without going too far off. Ow. First shin injury so far. I was kind enough to spare everyone to look at my legs after I did segment 1, but they were pretty gross.
Finally, the ground grew firmer as I gradually gained elevation, the birch flats eventually ended, and I entered a short stretch of spruce forest that lay up against the base of the mountain.
Not super ripe. Not the best. A little bit too tangy.
GeoWizard's epic straight-line mission series across England was shaped by his nightmare experience crossing multiple windfall and spruce plantations in winter rain. Monocultures full of hazardous downed trees and truly miserable conditions to just exist in, let alone cross on a predetermined path. It's worth a pause now to just slow down and appreciate the quiet beauty of a true natural spruce forest at the end of a summer in the far north. A dwarf species of dogwood, its leaves pocked with holes from herbivorous insects. Hollow-stemmed horsetails, one of the most primitive groups of vascular plants, can cover the ground in low-lying wetter areas. Despite their low stature, their earliest ancestors formed some of the first forests on land. Low-lying lingonberries, wild cranberries are one of several edible berries that are briefly abundant in late summer here. Net-leafed willow, a true willow and close cousin of any other willow tree, grows in a low mound form similar to several other species of tundra plants. Fireweed, now fully changed into fall colors, rivaled in depth in the forest undergrowth by those of wild roses. Cloudberries are the edible wild relative of blackberries and raspberries that I tried just a few minutes ago. Larkspurs are a close relative of the showy garden flowers, and their close cousin the monkshood is one of the most toxic plants of the region. A bite of the plant could be fatal, and even touching the flowers can absorb enough poison to numb the skin. Hair-like lichens drift from the branches of nearly every tree, lending an ancient feel to this forest. Despite these distractions, irresistible to me anyway, I also knew I was squandering valuable daylight since I was hoping to reach the top of the mountain in time for sunset. As the forest suddenly ended, nothing was left of this segment though but a nearly unbroken ascent up a steep and increasingly loose and rocky slope.
It's me and my metabolism now. It wasn't deliberate. Would have had to take whatever was on the line here, but I was really glad when I saw that this was a spot where it didn't transition right away from spruce forest to alders, as is so common here. So go straight, mostly straight into tundra.
Free fresh produce along the trail was actually a planned benefit of the timing of this trip in August, and something I will lose with an earlier summer attempt next year.
Our little chart's still not quite ripe. It's too bad. I'm sure it's not visible in the GoPro. There's a golden eagle circling in front of the cliffs. It's about 2 hours until sunset, and I'm kind of expecting I won't quite make it to the top by then. I'd been hoping to in case there was a good sunset and scenic view. Denali's not visible today, so that's out of the question, but could still be some nice views to the south. It is only 3/4 of a mile to the top, but a lot of climbing. 1,700 feet maybe. That's possible, I could make it. We'll see.
I didn't even record the entire climb because often it was nothing but walking 20 steps, breathing for a minute, and repeating. Finally into the real elevation gain after the mostly level walk since Jenny Creek, I was also able to confirm my negativity about the pack weight situation. Still, elevation was gained gradually and the view just kept getting better.
I already feel myself getting cold from sweat in the wind every time I stop. I think as soon as you get somewhere and stop climbing, stop working, you've got to change into dry clothes right away. So it should be okay till I get to the top, but then I gotta change as quick as I can. Still 1,000 feet to go.
As the slope increased, the soil thinned out and patches of loose rock began to appear, a hint of the worst part of the segment ahead.
I'll also say that at this point I'm seriously considering not continuing after tonight. Mainly the weather. And I could always figure out ways to go with less gear. Pack weight always factors in, but I think I'd be able to keep going. But overall, between the clouds and wind and rain, I don't think it would really do this justice. I'd potentially be having a miserable and unsafe time instead of a fun and spectacular unsafe time, which I'd rather have. So, unless things really look up by morning, I could still keep going. But we'll see how it goes. So I don't finish, hopefully I'd come back next July and keep trying until I get perfect weather or something. The high pitched ones are ground squirrels. The lower pitched single notes are collared pikas. I kind of figured I'd see some out here. I was hoping it would be with the sun out and get some good video of them. Didn't happen. I've hiked past a little lake before. 2 years ago in the peak of fall. It's a really great little spot. I'd like to go back there in winter sometime. About 650 feet to go or something. It's just almost all this. So far today I've climbed about a quarter of what was planned for tomorrow. And I'm not out of energy by any means today, but I just don't think it feels right to commit too hard to something I'm not sure I can do. And that even if I did, I would be in miserable conditions for the next day and a half. The squeaky toy sound of the pikas. I took a break and they were calling around me. I still haven't seen one yet.
Another symptom of the pack weight that worried me more for what was ahead was a little less balance and a higher chance of slips that ordinarily wouldn't happen, potentially really bad in the wrong spot.
Rock right in my bear spur right in the throat. Perfectly fine. Maybe after this plants it'll be alright. I find up stuff like this at the other end of this mountain in snow and ice in winter. The rocks are frozen together, but it's certainly not any better to climb.
When planning the line, I knew this slope wasn't bad enough to affect the line placement compared to the other challenges, but it looked potentially bad enough that I wasn't sure whether I'd need to deviate around some of the rocks. I'd climbed this mountain before, but only from the far end and only before I planned this mission, so at most I might have glanced off the top with no idea I'd ever be creeping up this hillside. Gradually working my way out of the worst of the loose rocks, I was able to find patches now where the vegetation had managed to get established enough to build up soil and hold the rocks together, and the very worst part of the climb was over. While this climb was by no means insignificant, the third largest on the line actually, it still differed from the worst two climbs by not really having anywhere to fall, as long as I didn't just completely tumble backwards or something. If I had proceeded between the wet weather, high winds, and pack weight, I would have had to take the higher risk of slips and falls into account, and my odds of excessive deviations also would have been way higher. I still wish I could have gone ahead, but never doubted the choice to bail. The video I'll have from the September hike actually includes a crossing of an area I think is close to the conditions at the crest of the range in early winter snow as some further confirmation. And watching the weather and webcams for the days I was scheduled to be crossing the range on this attempt, I absolutely would have been in dense clouds from the end of day 2 until the end of the mission. There would have been nothing to see. On top of all of that, there was the very real risk that at the end of the second day, at the worst point in the weather forecast, I could find myself in clouds and rain high on an unprotected ridgeline with wind gusts forecast up to 50 to 80 miles an hour. Conditions where changing into dry clothes would be difficult or impossible, and my shelter honestly could even get blown out of my hands and across the wilderness before I could get under cover. That would end the trip in a particularly miserable way.
So I think I stayed in the platinum zone all day because there wasn't really that much of a big obstacle, but I'm gonna go to the left around this, and that'll look right on the line now. So probably still might finish this segment platinum, even if it's the only one I finish. But it's looking right. Oh, stay to the right of that rock outcrop.
Still hundreds of feet below the top, once I made it past the rock outcrops, the substrate at least changed from mostly loose rock to mostly plants and stable rock, and the worry of additional slips at least was pretty much over.
So this is not going to get the good camera out of it. There's 3 species of ptarmigans here. Willow rock and white-tailed. I think these are rock ptarmigans. White-tailed I think are smaller. But rock and white-tailed both spend time in higher elevations. Willows usually down low in the willow shrubs like where I saw them before. I've only seen these a few times.
The angle of the slope barely changed from the bottom to the top, but finally it felt like I was over the climb and the top of the mountain was just ahead. And I'd made it barely before sunset after all.
I don't think this is even quite the real summit. A couple more steps. Let's see. Maybe it is. Nice.
Unsure whether I'd even be able to see these mountains again in the morning, I caught a few minutes of video and used that as a chance in the increasing wind and dropping temps to change into some dry layers as quick as I could. Even with a fast change, I still almost immediately found myself shivering unhappily until I could find a spot where I could sit out of the wind and let my metabolism catch up. The climb had been sheltered from the wind, mostly sunny and a bit warm, honestly. And the rapid change in conditions at the top of a mountain after a hard climb is something I've unpleasantly encountered before. Anyway, though, the next segment of the line was in full view from here, a roller coaster of a hike over 4 more smaller ridges, totaling 4,000 feet of climbing, before crossing the upper headwaters of the Savage River and a final 2,000-foot climb to the crest of the range. The mountains in between are formed of soft sedimentary rocks, smoothed by glaciers, and really aren't that dramatic. But everything changes at the crest and a shift to volcanic rocks, and the scenery on the other side isn't even hinted at from here. Unfortunately, the view from here also isn't quite good enough to fully assess the challenge of the very crest of the range, the single most worrying spot on the line. I'll find out when I get there, I guess. Denali was even nearly clear, the 20,000-foot summit lit up by the last rays of the sun even after it had set for me.
Denali even came out a little bit. Fang Mountain barely got lit up by the sun. I just have to walk an easy half mile and go get in the sleeping bag. It's not that cold out, but I put some extra layers on, but I was still sweating underneath, so got a little cool sitting there.
And even though I had low expectations with the high thin clouds, the sunset itself was actually pretty nice too. After a night made a little less pleasant by dripping condensation from the residual sweat steaming off of me and wind picking up the entire time, the morning was still surprisingly clear.
Heading back to get the beer canister from where I stashed it. A real worry in places like this can be having a bear knock it off of a high mountain and rolls them half mile down the wrong way or something. So I had to leave it in a flat area quite a ways away from the campsite. Nice that Denali was back out. I'll go back to the line and take a final look doing it.
I had a last view of both directions along the straight line from here, the view to the north towards the line's start, partially blocked by the high ridges I climbed in episode 1. The permit had required me to stay in a specific unit that began just off the west shoulder of the slope. Fortunately, only a short descent from the top.
Something I'm sad about for future references, I still can't see if there's a stream down at the bottom of this valley. I mean, there should be, but I can't see any water, and that would be really helpful to know. If I were to come back like next July and do this, you have to camp out of sight of the road in summer here. And the nice thing about camping with a bivy is, even though the road is right over there, all you need is a 2 or 3 foot deep depression and you're totally out of sight. Even just while packing up, the clouds are already way lower on the top of the ridge over there. Ultimately, I think a good move not to keep going. So at 3 miles back to the road.
Having climbed this mountain multiple times in summer and winter, and always by the east end, aside from the straight line mission, I still don't have a good way around this rock slope on the east end. It's often wet in summer, crusted over with shallow snow and ice in winter, and it's never easy, but the view from the top is worth it, and in fact today was actually the first time I had ever seen Denali clear from the top in summer.
I'm guessing that's from a wolf. Love to see one out here. I've seen one in the park before and a couple somewhere else, but never really good rewarding a sighting of a wolf here at Denali.
This sheltered valley must have a slight difference in microclimate that delayed seasonal changes in plants, and it still had a very large patch of fireweed in full bloom. Fireweed's a disturbance-tolerant plant, as the name hints, and roadsides in the north are often lined with it, as well as its habit of growing in previously burned areas.
So here's my breakdown of, I guess, when I gave up. I could tell by the time I got to the top yesterday. I mean, pack weight's part of the problem, but I was just never going to be able to manage energy and temperature in a way that would get me through, especially the next day getting over the crest of the range in terrible weather. It was pretty mild yesterday, honestly. Not that cold, not that windy, but I got chilled pretty quick as soon as I got to the top, or anytime I stopped moving. I'm a really lightly built person. I'm sort of tuned to high temperature midsummer desert activities, so I'm good at cooling off, and unfortunately that's kind of a weakness here. So between the heavy pack probably wearing me out old prematurely, the wind and rain just really making it difficult to stay dry, and I have rain gear with me, but trying to get into dry clothes and get into a sleeping bag, like that whole effort would be a problem. So I kind of, like I originally set out thinking falls were probably my greatest risk here, but by the time I got to where I was feeling like I needed to abandon it yesterday, it seemed pretty clearly hypothermia was probably the risk I should focus on. On top of that, some other secondary things, like I have a knee problem and it didn't act up at all out here doing episode 1, even though I hiked more, a lot more. Maybe just the pack weight, but it's been kind of bothering me. A couple other minor things that wouldn't necessarily stop me, but basically there's a list of things that were less than ideal to uncomfortable to dangerous, and nothing really arguing for continuing on. So hopefully next summer I'll come up with a plan that is workable. If I can do it in July, figure out some alternative gear arrangements. I mostly, aside from some of the camera stuff, need what I have, but that's partly because of the weather I was expecting, so maybe I can just start planning early and keep postponing until I get a perfect week. So, I don't know why this looks so much wider and less easy to cross than yesterday. I'm several miles east, but there should be, you'd think, less water if anything.
Back again at Jenny Creek, maybe 18 hours after crossing it further downstream on the start of the attempt. I had the same feeling as the first crossing. It looked almost easy enough to find a way, but again, I probably wasted enough time. I should have just taken my shoes off and waited. After passing by what would be my solution several times, I finally decided this stick was the best hope as a natural bridge. Dropped it in the stream and figured I was willing to risk one wet foot if it didn't hold, which fortunately it did.
I am prepared to accept a wet foot if this doesn't work out. Better than I expected. Better than I deserved, probably. Jenny Creek often doesn't even freeze completely over in winter because it's spring fed. stays fairly warm. So I've been out here when it's, you know, minus 20 or colder, and with liquid water at 32 degrees, 50 degrees hotter than the air around, it's just steaming and fills the whole valley with ice fog that freezes into tiny crystals in the cold air. Makes really cool rainbows around the sun. It's just one of the best visual effects of winter weather, honestly.
One last uneventful mile of birch all uphill to the road, and my short-lived August 2024 straight line mission attempt met its end. The results of this segment are pretty simple. I didn't expect major challenges on this segment as long as the rock outcrops were passable. It's the only segment I didn't expect major challenges, and that's what I got. Not only a non-zero Burdell score, but a pretty good one at that. The largest deviation of the segment was actually barely into the attempt at the first Jenny Creek crossing, where, ignoring the slightly erroneous score my line measurement, I incurred a deviation of just over 16 meters to avoid taking my pants off. All other deviations aren't even worth looking at individually, 10 meters here or there from a lack of attention, a patch of trees, or the rocks along the steep climb. I got over the failed attempt almost immediately. While I thought I had planned well enough to give myself a good chance at success, the weather that actually happened this year meant my attempt was doomed from the moment I set my first date in August. The only break in the weather after that point long enough to support a reasonable attempt was actually Labor Day weekend, early September, which was forecast to be mediocre but turned out lovely despite some snow remaining on the heights. As it was, I couldn't have made the trip up to Alaska right then. Even though my own limitations contributed in a small way, things beyond my control really had made the delay the only sensible choice. I hope some of you keep an eye out for whatever happens next summer and whatever I come up with to do in between as well. I'll be back out here again as long as I can keep coming.